Margaret always believed that their love was steadfast and their marriage built on honesty. But after Charles's passing, she discovers a hidden past he never spoke of. A secret shaped by duty and sacrifice. A long-forgotten photograph and letter that change everything, and a quest for answers that could rewrite the story she thought she knew. Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're tuning in from today, and if you enjoy this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more. Margaret Turner's life changed irrevocably the day that man in the trench coat appeared. She was 76, recently widowed after 54 years of marriage to Charles Turner, the epitome of a steadfast husband. Charles had served briefly as a diplomat in Europe. He mentioned it in passing, though never in great detail. Whenever Margaret asked, he would smile politely, deflecting with a soft chuckle and a quiet murmur that his time overseas had been dull and quite overblown. That was his way. Even-keeled, courteous, fixing small problems around the house before anyone noticed them. Margaret used to say she never worried about a faucet leak or a creaking floorboard, because Charles would handle it before a complaint passed her lips. She expected his funeral to be a day of grief and gentle goodbyes, not a trigger for unraveling a lifetime of secrets. But that unassuming man, a stranger in his 60s, possibly Austrian by the accent or manner, approached the casket in the final moments of the service at St. Mary's Church. He placed a single red rose on the polished wood, then inclined his head toward Margaret. The sorrow in his eyes was personal, like he was mourning a friend or ally. Before Margaret could ask who he was or how he knew Charles, he turned on his heel and slipped away among the mourners. She did not see him again. No name, no card, no explanation. Just that rose, bright against the dark sheen of the casket. Margaret's daughter, Lillian, caught a glimpse of him too. They shared a perplexed look, but in the swirl of condolences and the hush of organ music, the moment passed unremarked. 2 days later, Margaret's routine felt stark without Charles. She had lived in the same home for decades, a warm cottage in a quiet English village. The furniture arrangement seldom changed. The tea cupboard was always stocked. She believed she knew every corner of that house. But on that particular afternoon, she decided to tidy Charles's study. He had kept it locked all these years, kindly, politely, but firmly. If she teased him about the secrecy, he would brush it off with a gentle smile, saying it was full of dull diplomatic papers, nothing worth seeing. She never pressed. She trusted him. Now, with Charles gone, the key to that study sat on the desk in the master bedroom. Margaret hesitated, her heart heavy, as she unlocked the door. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, as though dust motes had gathered patiently in the corners while he was ill. She had expected neat stacks of paper, perhaps a record or two from his diplomatic days. She did not expect a puzzle. At first, everything looked as she imagined. A worn leather chair by a modest desk, shelves lined with references on European history, a small mantel with an old clock. She dusted quietly, tears threatening when she remembered how Charles once teased her about hating clutter. She moved to the mantel clock, an antique piece that Charles had carefully maintained. As she nudged it to wipe beneath, the back panel shifted with a soft click. Surprise jolted her. She set the clock aside, discovering a hidden compartment behind it. Inside lay a single photograph, folded and yellowed with age. Margaret's breath caught. She pulled it out gently, her hands trembling. The image showed a man in his late 20s, definitely Charles, her Charles, though younger, with sharper features and a subtle grin. He sat on a park bench. Beside him was a striking woman with auburn hair, face turned partially away, and between them 2 identical toddlers. Something about the posture told Margaret these were not random strangers. The photo had a date scrawled on the back, August 1961, K. Then another note, "Don't forget what you left behind." The handwriting was Charles's. She felt a wave of disbelief and confusion. Her mind reeled. Who were these people? Was Charles a father before they met? The possibility hammered her chest. She and Charles married in 1963. The dates lined up eerily. She confronted her daughter, Lillian, that evening. They studied the photograph under the warm kitchen light. Lillian's face registered shock. She recognized the younger Charles at once. Her father had the same calm eyes, the same gentle curve of his mouth. But the presence of a woman and two toddlers contradicted everything Lillian knew. They both speculated. Could these be children from a prior marriage? Or was it some secret involvement during Charles's diplomatic service? The only clue was the letter K near the date, presumably referencing the woman's name. The note "Don't forget what you left behind" hung ominously in the air, as though someone had urged him not to abandon them. But he evidently did. Margaret felt a strange swirl of betrayal, sorrow, and curiosity. She wanted answers, not guesses. She resolved to find the truth. She began by scouring Charles's files. Indeed, the desk drawers contained old references to Austrian official events, ticket stubs from Vienna operas dated 1961. He had traveled more than he claimed, apparently. She found scraps of German phrases scribbled in the margins of notes. Nothing gave a direct mention of the woman or the children, only faint hints that he had spent time around that year in Vienna, possibly near the Russian embassy. She recalled the funeral guest who seemed Austrian, the single rose. Could he be linked to this puzzle? Margaret decided to act boldly. She told Lillian she would go to Vienna herself. She was no young woman, but she had enough health and determination to make the trip. Lillian offered to come, but Margaret insisted on going alone, feeling that this was a personal mission to discover Charles's hidden past. Perhaps it was reckless to chase phantoms in a foreign city, but she could not rest while these questions festered. The flight to Vienna, arranged swiftly, felt surreal. She had traveled a bit in her youth, but never alone. The plane's hum reminded her of the steady presence Charles once provided, a presence now replaced by a painful emptiness. She gazed out the window, thinking how he must have flown these same skies decades before, carrying secrets she never suspected. She half expected to see his reflection on the glass, that calm, slightly apologetic smile he wore whenever he had to break news to her gently. Vienna greeted her with a crisp autumn breeze, the city's grand architecture stoic under the late afternoon sun. She booked a modest room in a small pension near the city center. Everything felt foreign, from the echo of footsteps on cobblestone streets to the swirl of German words around her. She carried the photograph in her handbag, determined to find the park bench or the place it was taken. She began a methodical search, starting with tourist offices and old city maps. Yet the local staff offered only polite shrugs. The city had changed much since 1961. War-damaged buildings had been replaced. Embassies shifted. She began to fear it was a lost cause. But an older archivist at the Vienna Tourist Archives pointed her toward a used bookstore rumored to keep old postcards and photographs of the city's evolution. Tired, but holding on to hope, Margaret visited the cramped shop one drizzly afternoon. The proprietor was a stooped, elderly woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Margaret showed her the photograph, explaining she sought that bench, that building in the background. The woman peered at it, lips pursed in concentration. After a moment, she nodded and said something about the old Russian embassy, which was demolished in the 1970s. The bench had stood outside it on a public walkway. She recognized the style of the wrought iron street lamp in the background. Margaret's heart pounded. She pressed further about the auburn-haired woman. The shopkeeper said her name was likely Katharina Bauer, an Austrian who had worked with American intelligence as a translator. She was well known in certain circles for her involvement in Cold War negotiations. She had twin sons, father rumored to be a Western diplomat, but no official record. No father's name on the birth certificate, just blank. Margaret felt a chill. This must be them, the woman, the twins. The father, Charles. So Charles had fathered children with this Katharina. Everything pointed that direction. The revelation left her breathless. Thanking the proprietor, Margaret left, adrenaline surging. She had a name, Bauer. Over the next week, she scoured phone books, online listings, old newspaper articles. It was an uphill battle. She had only scraps to go on. At last, a tenuous lead emerged. A mention of an Anton Bauer who ran a small art gallery, possibly connected to a woman named Katharina. She followed it doggedly, eventually finding an address. Another lead surfaced for a Lucas Bauer, rumored to be a musician. She felt an odd mixture of excitement and dread. If these men were indeed Charles's children, they might resent her intrusion. But she had come too far to retreat. One mild afternoon, Margaret located the gallery in a quieter district of Vienna. She stepped inside, heart pounding, the interior lit by warm lamps showcasing abstract paintings. Behind the counter stood a man in his 40s or 50s, tall, with auburn strands in his hair that reminded her of the woman in the photo. She gathered her courage and introduced herself. The man's name was indeed Anton Bauer. She asked if his mother was Katerina, once involved in translations during the Cold War. He frowned warily, asking who she was. Margaret took a breath, offering the photograph as explanation. The moment he saw it, his eyes widened. He swallowed, turning pale. The next words he spoke told her everything. "That's my mother. That's my brother and me." Then he pointed to the man on the bench. "I only remember a few details about him. The only photograph Mother kept of him." Margaret's heart nearly stopped. She explained in a trembling voice that the man was her husband, Charles Turner, whom she married in 1963, 2 years after that photo's date. Anton reeled at the revelation. He grew silent, jaw tight. Margaret felt a wave of guilt. She insisted she never knew about them, that Charles never confessed any prior family or entanglements. Anton's eyes flickered with a swirl of emotions. Anger, sadness, perhaps faint understanding. He told Margaret that he and his twin brother, Lucas, always wondered about their father. Their mother died years ago, leaving behind only rumors. This was the first confirmation they had that their father was real, an English diplomat or something. Margaret's chest ached at the heartbreak that must have shaped these men's lives. Anton said he needed time to process. He told her to return the next day, that he would speak with Lucas. She gave him her phone number, unsure if he would ever call. She felt a twinge of empathy for these half-strangers, forced to confront a father who disappeared to marry another woman. The magnitude of it weighed heavily. She spent a sleepless night in her pension, imagining how Charles might have felt, forced to choose between one family and the life he eventually built with her. The next day, she revisited the gallery, bracing for anger or rejection. Instead, she found both brothers waiting, Lucas a wiry man with a musician's posture, holding a cello case. The tension was thick as they stood around a small table in the gallery's back room. Margaret repeated her story. How she discovered the photo, how Charles said little about his time in Europe, how he died recently, leaving a swirl of unanswered questions. Lucas was more outspoken. He demanded how Charles could vanish, fathering them, then remarrying as if none of it mattered. Margaret's voice shook as she insisted she never knew, that Charles had never mentioned prior children, let alone a love affair with their mother. Anton eventually retrieved an old letter from a locked drawer, a letter apparently found among Katerina's belongings after her death. It was addressed to K, from C, referencing the children. The letter was never mailed, a piece of history trapped in a box. It contained an anguished confession from Charles, who wrote that he was threatened with charges of treason if he tried to bring Katerina and the twins to the West. He wrote that the authorities claimed she and the children might be labeled Soviet collaborators, that their crossing would endanger them all. Terrified, he made a choice to abandon them for the sake of his diplomatic obligations and to protect them from retribution. "I couldn't risk it," the letter read. "I had to choose. I chose my country, but I never forgave myself." The lines hammered at Margaret's heart. This was the Charles she knew, calm, composed, always picking duty over personal desires. Even so, the cost of that choice was monstrous. Still, the revelations continued. Lucas produced a second document, an intelligence file from the Cold War era. It suggested that Charles had been offered a trade by U.S. intelligence. Either expose an American double agent or relinquish his connection to this Austrian family. He apparently protected the double agent's identity to preserve a larger operation, effectively ensuring that no one discovered the man's infiltration. In exchange, Charles severed ties with Katerina and the boys. The idea that Charles had sacrificed a woman and 2 children for the sake of espionage or some grand intelligence game sickened Margaret. She felt faint, the blood draining from her cheeks as she read. No matter the justification, It was a betrayal that haunted him for the rest of his life. She recalled how once, years ago, she caught Charles brooding over a glass of whiskey, a distant sadness in his eyes he never explained. Perhaps that sorrow was the memory of the family he left behind in Vienna. Lucas's voice was bitter. He sacrificed our mother for a mole. He sacrificed all of us. Margaret wanted to defend Charles, to say he was a good man, but the words stuck in her throat. She had no illusions left. He had been kind to her, unwavering in his devotion, but evidently capable of secrets and moral compromises. The clang of that reality crushed her. That night, back in her hotel room, she opened the final envelope. The brothers had given it to her, labeled with her name, presumably discovered among Katerina's old items. Inside was a letter from Charles to Margaret, never delivered, likely intended in case she learned about his hidden life. Margaret read it with trembling hands. "My love, if you ever find out about them, I want you to know this. I never planned to lie to you. I just didn't know how to carry both truths. I had a life before you, a life I abandoned for reasons I thought were noble. But I spent the rest of my days wondering if I'd made the wrong choice. If you hate me, I understand. But please know, I loved you, and I never stopped loving them." Tears streamed down Margaret's cheeks. She read and reread the letter, absorbing the anguish behind his measured words. She pictured Charles in the living room of their home, every day hiding a piece of himself. She recalled small remarks he made about regrets and choices, half lost in conversation. She realized now those were glimpses of a torment he never fully revealed. She cried fiercely, letting the heartbreak wash over her. The next morning, she faced the brothers again in a small cafe. They sat in uneasy silence for a moment. She tried to apologize, though she had no direct guilt for his decisions. She expressed sorrow that their mother died without closure, that they grew up fatherless. Lucas's jaw clenched, tears brimming in his eyes as he muttered about how hard it was for them, how everyone whispered rumors about their father being some Western agent who abandoned them. Anton listened quietly, occasionally interjecting with measured words about wanting to understand who Charles really was. Margaret could offer only glimpses. He was thoughtful, a caretaker, always fixing broken things. She realized how cruel fate was that he could fix everything except this monstrous betrayal. They parted with no illusions of a warm family reunion. Margaret had no illusions that they would want a deep relationship with her, the widow of the man who chose a diplomatic career and new marriage over them. But at least the truth was out. She left them her contact information, saying they could call or visit if they ever wanted to share more. They said they needed time. She returned to her hotel with a heavy heart. Her flight home was somber. She spent hours gazing out the plane window, replaying the conversation. She imagined how Charles's final years might have been overshadowed by the memory of 2 children he left behind. She pictured the man in the trench coat at the funeral. Could he have been an old friend or contact from that era, paying respects with a single rose, acknowledging the secret life Charles once led? The final puzzle piece clicked. That man must have known about the family in Vienna, known about the children, enough to come and pay silent tribute. She walked into her quiet cottage, the emptiness of the living room amplifying her fresh sense of betrayal. She took a day to gather her thoughts. Then she visited Charles's grave. Lillian accompanied her part of the way, but Margaret asked to be alone at the final approach. She brought 3 items: the photograph, the letter Charles never mailed to Katerina, and a smooth white stone etched with 2 names, Anton and Lucas. She knelt by Charles's headstone, tears slipping free as she placed the stone gently in the grass. She whispered a few words that came unbidden. "You weren't the man I thought I married, but you were the man who loved." In 2 directions. The quiet wind rustled the leaves, as though acknowledging her heartbreak. She felt the weight on her chest lift slightly, not gone, but eased by understanding. She left the photograph and letter in her handbag, deciding she could not bury them. They were now part of her own story, the truth she carried forth. She stood in silence for a long moment, letting tears dry on her cheeks. She had no illusions that this revelation was easy or just. But she believed Charles had tried in his own flawed way to love both families, and that had torn him apart. Maybe that explained why he was so obsessive about caring for small issues at home, mending a leak or a creaking stair. Perhaps these trivial repairs were the only things he could truly fix. She turned and walked away, steps unsteady but resolute. The heavy stone of deception had cracked, letting a little light in. She would never have the future she once envisioned, but she had the present truth. And sometimes that was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.